Section 1 of Volume 1, A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by J.C. Guan. Volume 1 of A Popular History of France from the Earliest Times by François Guizot. Translated by Robert Black. Chapter 1. Gaul. The Frenchman of today inhabits a country long ago civilized and Christianized, where, despite of much imperfection and much social misery, 38 millions of men live in security and peace, under laws equal for all and efficiently upheld. There is every reason to nourish great hopes of such a country, and to wish for it more and more of freedom, glory, and prosperity. But one must be just towards one's own times, and estimate at their true value advantages already acquired and progress already accomplished. If one were suddenly carried 20 or 30 centuries backward into the midst of that which was then called Gaul, one would not recognize France. The same mountains reared their heads, the same plains stretched far and wide, the same rivers rolled on their course. There is no alteration in the physical formation of the country, but its aspect was very different. Instead of the fields all trim with cultivation and all covered with various produce, one would see inaccessible morasses and vast forests, as yet uncleared, given up to the chances of primitive vegetation, peopled with wolves and bears, and even the urns, or huge wild ox, and with elks too, a kind of beast that one finds no longer nowadays, save in the colder regions of northeastern Europe, such as Lithuania and Courland. Then wandered over the Champagne great herds of swine, as fierce almost as wolves, tamed only so far as to know the sound of their keeper's horn. The better sort of fruits and of vegetables were quite unknown. They were imported into Gaul, the greatest part from Asia, a portion from Africa and the islands of the Mediterranean, and others, at a later period, from the New World. Cold and rough was the prevailing temperature. Nearly every winter the rivers froze sufficiently hard for the passage of cars, and 3 or 4 centuries before the Christian era, on that vast territory comprised between the ocean, the Pyrenees, the Mediterranean, the Alps, and the Rhine, lived 6 or 7 millions of men, a bestial life, enclosed in dwellings dark and low, the best of them built of wood and clay, covered with branches or straw, made in a single round piece, open to daylight by the door alone, and confusedly heaped together behind a rampart, not inartistically composed of timber, earth, and stone, which surrounded and protected what they were pleased to call a town. Of even such towns there were scarcely any as yet, save in the most populous and least uncultivated portion of Gaul, that is to say, in the southern and eastern regions, at the foot of the mountains of Auvergne and the Cevennes, and along the coast of the Mediterranean. In the north and the west were paltry hamlets, as transferable almost as the people themselves, and on some islet amidst the morasses, or in some hidden recess of the forest, were huge entrenchments formed of the trees that were felled, where the population, at the first sound of war-cry, ran to shelter themselves with their flocks and all their movables. And the war-cry was often heard. Men living grossly and idly are very prone to quarrel and fight. Gaul, moreover, was not occupied by one and the same nation, with the same traditions and the same chiefs. Tribes very different in origin, habits, and date of settlement were continually disputing the territory. In the south were Iberians or Aquitanians, Phoenicians and Greeks; in the north and northwest, Kymrians or Belgians; everywhere else Gauls or Celts, the most numerous settlers, who had the honor of giving their name to the country. Who were the first to come, then, and what was the date of the first settlement? Nobody knows. Of the Greeks alone does history mark with any precision the arrival in southern Gaul. The Phoenicians preceded them by several centuries, but it is impossible to fix any exact time. The information is equally vague about the period when the Kymrians invaded the north of Gaul. As for the Gaul and the Iberians, there is not a word about their first entrance into the country, for they are discovered there already at the first appearance of the country itself in the domain of history. The Iberians, whom Roman writers call Aquitanians, dwelt at the foot of the Pyrenees, in the territory comprised between the mountains, the Garonne, and the ocean. They belonged to the race which, under the same appellation, had peopled Spain, but by what route they came into Gaul is a problem which we cannot solve. It is much the same in tracing the origin of every nation, for in those barbarous times men lived and died without leaving any enduring memorial of their deeds and their destinies, no monuments, no writings, just a few oral traditions, perhaps, which are speedily lost or altered. It is in proportion as they become enlightened and civilized that men feel the desire and discover the means of extending their memorial far beyond their own lifetime. That is the beginning of history, the offspring of noble and useful sentiments, which cause the mind to dwell upon the future and to yearn for long continuance, sentiments which testify to the superiority of man over all other creatures living upon our earth, which foreshadow the immortality of the soul, and which are warrant for the progress of the human race, by preserving for the generations to come what has been done and learned by the generations that disappear. By whatever route and at whatever epoch the Iberians came into the southwest of Gaul, they abide there still in the department of the Lower Pyrenees, under the name of the Basque, a people distinct from all its neighbors in features, costume, and especially language, which resembles none of the present languages of Europe, contains many words which are to be found in the names of rivers, mountains, and towns of olden Spain, and which presents a considerable analogy to the idioms, ancient and modern, of certain peoples of northern Africa. The Phoenicians did not leave, as the Iberians did, in the south of France, distinct and well authenticated descendants. They had begun about 1100 B.C. to trade there. They went thither in search of furs and gold and silver, which were got either from the sand of certain rivers, as for instance the Alege, in Latin Aurigera, or from certain mines of the Alps, the Cevennes, and the Pyrenees. They bought in exchange stuffs dyed with purple, necklaces and rings of glass, and above all, arms and wine, a trade like that which is nowadays carried on by the civilized peoples of Europe with the savage tribes of Africa and America. For the purpose of extending and securing their commercial expeditions, the Phoenicians founded colonies in several parts of Gaul, and to them is attributed the earliest origin of Nemosis, Nim, and of Alesia, near Semur. But, at the end of 3 or 4 centuries, these colonies fell into decay. The trade of the Phoenicians was withdrawn from Gaul, and the only important sign it preserved of their residence was a road which, starting from the eastern Pyrenees, skirted the Gallic portion of the Mediterranean, crossed the Alps by the pass of Tenda, and so united Spain, Gaul, and Italy. After the withdrawal of the Phoenicians, this road was kept up and repaired, at first by the Greeks of Marseilles, and subsequently by the Romans. As merchants and colonists, the Greeks were, in Gaul, the successors of